Hey, today we are talking all about saturated fats. Are they our friend or our enemy in our diets? So today I'm going to break down this research study that was actually a really big meta-analysis where they looked at a bunch of other studies to determine a greater impact. So this was published in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, and it evaluated saturated fats and health, a reassessment and proposal for the food-based recommendations. This was a meta-analysis of all the randomized trials and observational studies and found no beneficial effects of reducing saturated fatty acid intake on cardiovascular disease and total mortality, but instead actually found protective effects against stroke in those who ate the most saturated fats. So saturated fats do raise low density lipoprotein cholesterol. We know that, but the type of LDL that is reduced are the large particles, and the large particles are not correlated to increased risk of cardiovascular disease. The reduction of saturated fatty acids does not reduce these small, more risky LDL particle sizes. So we can't just look at our food as one type of nutrient. We have to look at the entire profile of the foods that we actually do consume. For instance, whole fat dairy, unprocessed quality meats, and dark chocolate are high in saturated fatty acids, but they are not associated at all with increased cardiovascular disease risks. The totality of available evidence does not support further limiting the intake of such foods. So this was basically a quote taken straight out of the article that says, "There's nothing in the science that supports continuing to reduce saturated fatty acid intake." Now, the recommendations have been to follow a low saturated fatty acid intake diet. Those recommendations have been around since the 70s, and specifically the recommendations to consume less than 10% of your total calories from saturated fatty acids have been around since about the 80s. Most of those recommendations will also recommend low fat intake in general, but then they will specify that saturated fatty acids should be the most reduced with less than 10% of the total caloric intake coming from saturated fats. So if we look at the multiple studies that this paper analyzed, over 400,000 people have been studied specifically related to saturated fatty acid intake. Some of these studies found no evidence that reducing saturated fatty acid intake reduces cardiovascular disease or mortality from cardiovascular disease. And a few studies did show a very mild reduction in risk, but only a few of these big studies. So let's talk a little bit about the biochemistry. Saturated fatty acids come in short lengths, medium lengths, long lengths, and very long lengths. And those are based on the number of carbons in the chain. How long the molecule is also determines the melting point. So if it has more than 10 carbons, typically they are solid at room temperature, and the shorter chains are typically liquid at room temperature. But there's also several configurations of saturated fatty acids. They can be in long straight chains, or they can actually be in branches where they branch off from the main core. And within any kind of food, you don't just find one kind of fat. You'll find some shorts, some longs, some mediums, some branch, some straights. There's a combination in every kind of food. So it's not really that simple to just say all saturated fats are bad. There's a huge variety here. So when we follow the recommendations to reduce fatty acid intake, specifically saturated fatty acids, but overall fats in general, we have to replace those calories with something, and we tend to replace them with more carbohydrates. But higher carbohydrate eating is not associated with a reduced rate of cardiovascular disease. It may actually be involved in an increased total mortality risk. So not only is higher carbohydrate not helping your cardiovascular disease risk, but it's actually increasing your risk of dying of other things as well. And very long chain saturated fatty acids are not associated with any increased cardiovascular or coronary heart disease risks. Now let's look at some of the studies individually. The PURE study looked at 125,000 people, most of whom did not have cardiovascular disease. These people lived in 18 different countries on 5 different continents, and they found that high intake of all kinds of fats were actually associated with lower risk of death and had no association with cardiovascular disease. A higher carbohydrate diet was associated with a high risk of death, but not specifically cardiovascular disease death in this study. Again, those with the highest saturated fatty acid intake had the lowest risk of stroke. The Women's Health Initiative study is the largest study of women really ever conducted. Looked at 49,000 women, and the risk of heart attack and stroke was unaffected by 8 years of low-fat eating, with saturated fat being less than 10% of their total intake. So after 8 years of low-fat eating, these women had no better chances of not having coronary heart disease than those who were eating more fat. The pre-DIMED study compared a standard low-fat diet to a higher-fat Mediterranean-style diet with nuts and olive oils and higher amounts of animal fats. The total increase in the Mediterranean-style eating was about 4.5% higher than the standard low-fat diet group, and it also happened to include more saturated fats from the animal products. Major cardiovascular events and deaths were significantly reduced in the Mediterranean-style diet group compared to the low-fat diet group. So again, the fat intake didn't hurt them, it actually helped them. Now, a brand new study that was just published followed almost 200,000 people in the UK for over 10 years, and they found no association between saturated fatty acid intake and cardiovascular disease incidence. In contrast, those that were consuming the highest polyunsaturated fatty acids were associated with higher cardiovascular disease risk. And a higher consumption of starch and sugar carbohydrates were associated with higher cardiovascular disease and mortality. In the context of contemporary diets, these observations would suggest there is little need to further limit the intake of total or saturated fat for most populations. Now, let's look a little bit at LDL cholesterol and how it relates to cardiovascular disease, because this is a really complicated story. So there's a bunch of conflicting information on how important LDL cholesterol is on cardiovascular disease risk. For instance, if you look at postmenopausal women who were given hormone replacement therapy that included both estrogen and progestin, which is the synthetic progesterone, and the women who were also on the cholesterol medications, saw tremendous decreases in their LDL cholesterol, but they didn't have better outcomes when it comes to cardiovascular disease risk. So even though their LDL dropped, their heart disease risk didn't. Now, if we look at dietary interventions to lower LDL cholesterol, such as a healthy Mediterranean-style diet, this reduces the risk of cardiovascular disease, but it actually doesn't have an impact on LDL numbers. Reduced saturated fatty acid intake reduces the large LDL particles, but those are the least correlated with cardiovascular disease. Small LDL particles, the most risky kind, are not reduced by low saturated fat diets, but low saturated fat diets do reduce HDL cholesterol, which is the protective, healthier kind of cholesterol that we actually want more of. So low saturated fat not only doesn't lower the bad cholesterol, but it does lower the good cholesterol. So this is not what we want for cardiovascular disease. Now, if we look at insulin resistance and saturated fatty acids, we have to look at the distinction between dietary saturated fatty acids and circulating saturated fatty acids. Circulating saturated fatty acids are not correlated with how much saturated fat you're eating, even though that would seem logical. You eat more saturated fat, you'd have more saturated fat in your blood. But that's not actually what happens. An increase in saturated fatty acid consumption by 2 to 3 fold was found to have either no effect or a reduction in circulating saturated fatty acids in the blood. When excess carbohydrates are converted to fat in the body, they are often made into what is referred to as palmitoleic acid. This is a type of fat that is not readily found in our food sources, so it's easy to distinguish with dietary versus what our bodies are making. And in this case, the body is making palmitoleic acid. And palmitoleic acid has been strongly and consistently linked to obesity, high triglycerides, high blood sugars, type 2 diabetes, heart failure, and cardiovascular disease mortality. So this would point to carbohydrates being the bigger risk than saturated fatty acids. So what are the true risk factors? Obesity and type 2 diabetes are huge contributors to cardiovascular disease risk. Insulin resistance and how well your insulin is functioning in the body also have a direct correlation on cardiovascular disease risk. The type of fat does matter that you're consuming, but what really matters isn't so much how much of it is saturated, but how much of it is naturally found on the planet versus mechanically or chemically refined. The mechanically and chemically refined oils are not in their natural form anymore, and they can really cause problems in the body. Many older studies blamed saturated fat, but when you really look at what the people were eating associated with these diets, they were actually eating a high proportion of hydrogenated fats, which means they were chemically and mechanically altered to be trans fats. And that was actually the problem, not the saturated fat. So the bottom line is our food is really complex. There is no one type of fat in our food. We also have a lot of other nutrients that play into how the food is digested and absorbed and metabolized and which hormones get turned on and which ones get suppressed. Food is really complex. And then once we take it in, the human body is really complex. And so we have all of those hormones and cofactors and vitamins and minerals and processes that determine how much we're burning, how much we're storing, and what we do with the nutrients that come in. So it's not about any one nutrient. It's about the whole profile of the foods and the person. Nature knows best. So avoid anything altered or refined and stick to what nature has provided.